Thank you for joining us today for the latest edition of the Alberta SPORE Knowledge Translation webinar series. My name is Diane Duncan, and I am the Program Coordinator, Training and Professional Development for the KT platform. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session entitled Knowledge Translation Approaches to Patient-Oriented Research in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Following a brief introduction, the presentation will use case studies to outline engagement tools, methods, and challenges faced in patient-oriented KT research. The scope of the projects presented includes cataloging the available literature by conducting systematic and scoping reviews, developing and implementing clinical pathways, investigating interdisciplinary ward rounds, and evaluating the experience of patient-family advisor participation in quality improvement events, and the development of knowledge translation tools for parents. Our presenters today are Dr. Thomas Schroeder, Chair in Health Quality Improvement Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Donna Goodrich, a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, and Dr. Shannon Scott, a professor and Canada Research Chair, Tier 2, in Knowledge Translation for Child Health at the University of Alberta. This presentation will prepare participants as they learn how to apply and use patient-oriented research. We hope the presentation will stimulate the interest of healthcare professionals, graduate students, and researchers. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this session is being recorded and the link will be provided along with the presentation slides to all participants after the webinar. The format for today's webinar will be approximately 40 minutes of content, followed by some time for questions. You can send questions throughout the presentation by typing them in the chat screen, and the presenters will respond to these questions at the end. I hope you enjoy today's session. On behalf of the Alberta SPORE Knowledge Translation Platform, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Thomas Schroeder and Dr. Donna Goodrich, who are joining us from the University of Saskatchewan, and Dr. Shannon Scott, who is here with us at the University of Alberta.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We focus in this presentation on applied case studies, which may not meet all patient-oriented criteria, but are very good examples for future research with a patient-oriented focus. The aim of this webinar is to stimulate your appetite for patient-oriented research and to discuss challenges. We will start off with an introduction to patient-oriented research and knowledge translation, followed by case studies 1 to 6, the methods we use and the progress to date. We will finish the webinar with a discussion on the challenges of conducting patient-oriented research and hints and tips for researchers who have an interest in knowledge translation and patient-oriented research. So, what is patient-oriented research? It aims to engage patients, focuses on patient-identified objectives and outcomes. It's usually conducted within a multidisciplinary team, and it aims to improve patient-oriented care. So, what does it really mean that patients help to identify patient-relevant outcomes? A good example might be mortality. I'm speculating that patients might not suggest mortality as their favored outcome. Knowledge translation, as opposed to patient-oriented research, knowledge translation is a process of synthesizing and implementing the best practice which is available to improve care. Now, I'm presenting my first case study on lean, ladies and gentlemen. Lean is a highly complex intervention based on lean principles, philosophies, and activities with the main aim to avoid waste. Waste in healthcare is, for example, patient waits and wait time. So the aim of our lean baseline study was to evaluate the first 2 years of lean implementation in Saskatchewan. It is highly dynamic And high-risk endeavor included the development of patient and stakeholder-identified research objectives, such as our main objective in the research question: for whom, how, and under what circumstances is lean management effective? The patient-oriented approach we used was a stakeholder workshop. We conducted the stakeholder workshop in 2013. The stakeholders included policymakers, healthcare managers, clinicians, and patients and their families in order to determine the research objectives and to develop a program theory to guide our investigation. Which progress did we make? This study has generated 7 interim program theories how lean changes leadership practices in Saskatchewan. We found that lean authorizes attention and quality improvement resources, provides an integrated set of tools, it changes leaders' attitudes, but it also demands a high level of expertise. However, we had a hard time to secure CIHR funding. We are now investigating smaller packages of lean, for example, nursing leadership and lean and the sustainability of lean management in pediatrics. This brings me to my case study number 2. In a project which is conducted in the province of Ontario, we test and try to identify best strategies to implement clinical pathways in an emergency department setting in Ontario. In this case study, we are using a balanced incomplete block design, and we randomized 16 community emergency departments to receive the intervention for one clinical pathway and serve as a control for the alternate clinical pathway. Thus, we are conducting 2 cluster randomized control trials in one study to evaluate the 2 different pathways. One pathway is designed for the management of asthma, and the other pathway is designed for the management of gastroenteritis. You may ask or want to know what does balanced incomplete block design means. That simply means that blocks, or in our example clusters, do not have the same size. That's why it's called incomplete. If the blocks or the clusters would all have the same size, it would be called uniform block design. In my case study number 3, where we develop, implement, and evaluate a clinical pathway for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, in Saskatchewan, we are conducting a 3-year COPD pathway implementation project by using an interrupted time series design in the form of a multiple baseline approach with control groups. In our case study number 2, as I said, we use a cluster randomized design, and in this theory-based intervention strategy, this strategy is used to develop 2 knowledge user-informed pediatric emergency pathways. As I said, one pathway is designed for the management of asthma, and the other pathway is designed for the management of gastroenteritis, or vomiting and diarrhea. We use the theoretical domains framework, which describes 14 theoretical domains from 33 behavior change strategies, and it's using 128 constructs to inform our intervention design. Knowledge users were interviewed during site visits to explore the acceptability and the potential issues with the pathway. In our case study 3, which is conducted here in Saskatchewan, the COPD clinical pathway was developed with expert and patient input. It will be implemented in 2 Saskatchewan health regions, the experimental groups, and 2 health regions will act as controls. The experimental and control groups will each contain 1 urban and 1 rural health region. What can I report on the preliminary results or the progress we made to date? In terms of case study number 2, 16 out of the 16 Ontario Emergency Department sites selected, 15 emergency department sites participated in the study. Pathway implementation is complete. Post-implementation qualitative interviews have been completed too, transcribed and analyzed. Chart audits to assess pathway uptake post-implementation are underway. That's interesting, I hope, but what's going on, or where are we with case study number 3? In our COPD pathway implementation study, where we start implementation in Regina in September this year, we have completed our systematic review to inform the pathway development. We have also assembled a patient advisory committee to assess relevance of the systematic review findings and the pathway recommendations. More importantly, our COPD patients on the team will also help to determine patient-relevant study outcomes and to design a patient version, which means a plain language version of the pathway with a strong focus on patient education. Now I'm handing over to Dr. Donna Goodrich, and she will speak about case study number 4 and 5.
Well, thanks very much, Thomas. I would like to just share a little bit of work that we're doing here in the province about, in terms of 2 different projects. The first is implementing interdisciplinary rounds at the bedside. And in this project, we had patient advisors engaged from the beginning. They were part of our application process, and we have 2 very different advisors. We have one from a group of seniors, very active in the community, and our other patient advisor is someone who's dealing with a chronic illness and has significant interface with the healthcare system. And so we thought they would be a nice complementary group. They've been astoundingly helpful in getting this project up and going. So we have 3 sites, 1 rural community hospital, 1 very busy medical unit, and 1 surgical unit in the city. And as part of this project, we're also including a scoping review on strategies that will promote patient and family engagement in acute care hospital settings. So we've already made significant progress on that scoping review. We found over 9,200 articles, and we've narrowed it down to about 465 that are relevant, and we're just going through the full article screening at this point. And our patient, one of our patient advisors is very keen. He's doing great work in helping us to work through the scoping review. And just a little bit, the second project, we looked at a patient advisor participation in QI events, and we really wanted to explore what that experience was like for them. So to give you a bit more detail, essentially what we were expecting, what our hypothesis is, our program theory, is that by implementing interdisciplinary rounds at the bedside, we will improve the patient experience, specifically with communication with providers. And the second thing that we're thinking is that team collaboration will be improved by enhancing the opportunities for team members to communicate. The ways that we're doing this involve patient and family interviews. We're doing them all the way through, and we're also following up after patients are discharged from the units using a care transitions measure, because we believe that that particular measure will help us to assess the quality of care over time as people go back into the community. To look at the team collaboration, we're mostly using surveys, a variety that are listed here, work experience, team attitudes, and team perceptions, and also the Alberta Context Tool to help us to understand a little bit more about the units, because they are very different units. And these interdisciplinary rounds are being implemented in quite different ways, and of course tailored to the context. So the other piece of this that's actually quite interesting is, I think, is that we're also conducting an ethnography of the team rounds, and it's being guided by a structured interdisciplinary team assessment tool that was developed by one of our team members. She is our patient family engagement lead within Skipper, and that's Mallory Keller. So we're grateful to her for having having put that tool together, and certainly it's been really helpful as we follow the progressive rounds and some of the issues that are going on. We're also looking at some of the trends and key measures of utilization. So what impact, might rounds have on length of stay, readmissions, and the time to the ward from the ED? That was something that people, especially the managers, really felt was an important thing to look at. So we finished our pre-implementation data collection, and we're right in the midst of a whole lot of interviews and team observations. So just a little bit about our looking at patient-family advisors. We had 18 patient-family advisors throughout the province participate in our project, and they had all been team members in a 5-day-long rapid process improvement workshop across Saskatchewan. And we had a medical student last summer go out and do some great interviews with these individuals. Whoops, I think I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Essentially what we found in these semi-structured interviews was there was a lot of talk about power, and we ended up using John Gaventa's theory of power to look at, what RPIWs really were. And what we found were that RPIWs really created new spaces, and these spaces were actually engineered to accord power to PFAs in ways they never had before, and really to make visible to everybody in the room that patient-family advisors can contribute to improved health care. So during this exercise, the power imbalances that usually occur were really flattened, and this resulted in the PFAs were very motivated to participate. They were recognized, and some of them, especially the people with maybe less positive experience, really welcomed the opportunity to have their stories heard by providers. So this is just a schematic really of, I think, that summarizes our findings and how the spaces of power changed over the time of the RPIW, beginning with, what is traditional healthcare usually like, what changed in the RPIW, and then finally, after the RPIW, what was different. Oops. So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Scott in Alberta.
Great. Thank you very much, Donna. Now I'm going to share case study number 6, which is some work that I'm doing with my colleague, Dr. Lisa Hartling, in the Department of Pediatrics here at the University of Alberta. We have been doing integrated knowledge translation work with parent stakeholders to optimize children's emergency care within a national network called TREC since 2012. This work has been funded by the Networks of Centers of Excellence since that point in time, and we now also have a 7-year CIHR Foundation grant to continue this work to 2023. So in the context of this case that I'm going to describe, what we're doing is we are working with parents and pediatric emergency healthcare professionals and our national network to develop and evaluate knowledge translation tools for parents with children with acute healthcare conditions. So the foundations of this research started back in 2012 when we did a national needs assessment in 37 emergency room departments across the country, so from coast to coast, and really wanted to get a sense of what the information needs and preferences were of healthcare consumers who brought their child to a general emergency room department for care. We also did a complementary arm looking at the information and needs and preferences of healthcare providers that work in general emergency room departments as well. And what's really patient-oriented about this research is that the findings from this needs assessment have really been the foundation for our work as we've moved forward. So we've taken the results from this national needs assessment that have been recently published in the Canadian Journal of Emergency Medicine in 2017, as well as a paper published last year in the Journal of Medical Internet Research that describes our data collection approach. We've taken these findings and really driven this national network in terms of our priorities. So really true to patient-oriented research is ensuring that we share our findings in ways that engage our end users and our audiences. So we're really making important strides in terms of how we're displaying and sharing our data. And this is just an example of two different ways that we've been sharing data. So some of the key messages from our needs assessment we're displaying as infographics and using them as part of a social media push out to the public to share important findings. So with the infographic on the left, one of the key findings from our needs assessment was that 39% of our respondents indicated that they actually are looking for information before they bring their child to the emergency room department. And we had a whole complement of questions following that to try and understand where they looked for information, how they looked, how they wanted to receive information moving forward. So really trying to ensure that our research fit with the needs of patients and our end users. We use very much a sequential approach in our research. So as I've mentioned, the first step was doing the national needs assessment. Then as we move forward and develop knowledge translation tools for parents, we do knowledge synthesis. So we synthesize the best available research knowledge on the topic, while concurrently interviewing parents who have recently experienced the clinical condition at hand to learn and understand what their experiences were having a child with a particular condition. And then based upon the results of the synthesis and the interviews, we develop a knowledge translation tool prototype. So we work with the creative team and develop this. The knowledge translation tools come in many different forms. We've been doing video whiteboards, electronic or e-books, as well as doing interactive infographics. Once we get a KT tool prototype, we receive feedback from parents and healthcare professionals. Last year, Dr. Hartling and myself, we developed a parent advisory group here in Edmonton. This group of volunteer parents, we have between 8 and 10 parents. We get together with them every 2 months, and we get their expert opinion in terms of our priorities on our research, different prototypes that we've been developing, and their feedback is absolutely integral as we go through this very iterative process of refining our tools. We also get expert feedback from the Pediatric Emergency Research Group of Canada, of which we're members. Annually, every year in January, we take prototypes of our tools to ensure that they are reflecting the best available research evidence. Once we have a very solid KT tool that has been vetted by our two groups, we do usability testing of these tools, and we do usability testing in a variety of different venues. Lately, we've been vetting the tools in emergency room departments in rural, remote, and urban settings, just to get a sense of different patterns and preferences. Upon completion of usability testing, then we do further refinement, and we have a dissemination plan, and we also post all of our tools on trek.ca. We also have a plan in place to ensure the evidence behind each tool is also up to date and current, and we are running and keeping abreast of any latest medical developments on each topic and refine those as needed. So in terms of progress to date, so the clinical conditions we've focused on have been driven by parents' information needs and requests. So we started off by developing an ebook and whiteboard video for croup. We've also got an ebook and whiteboard video for gastroenteritis. We have a very strong prototype in place for procedural pain, so a video and infographic, as well as for acute otitis media. And we're currently in the development phase for fever. And this fall, we are going to start recruiting parents for our concussion and fracture knowledge translation tools. So I think we've made really great strides in terms of that piece. And here's some screenshots in terms of how they look. The two on the left are just screenshots from our whiteboard videos. We pay particular attention. We want to ensure that the tools we're developing really correspond to as many people as possible. So we're really trying to ensure that the way we portray families in our tools corresponds to societal trends, and so that everybody can see themselves in the story or video. And now I'll turn it back to Thomas in Saskatchewan to wrap up our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shannon. I'm so proud that Shannon agreed to contribute to this presentation today because of her work and her position. She's definitely a superstar, and we are also proud to have her with us and doing it jointly together. Thank you very much. I hope for all the guys who are listening to our presentation that this was a not so boring presentation and lively enough to keep you all awake. And I would like to close this presentation with a few challenges we have experienced in patient-oriented research. And we refer not only to meaningful, engaging patients, but also other key stakeholders such as care providers, decision makers, etc. throughout the entire research process. So in general, we've found it pretty challenging to engage patients in a meaningful way, in a way to neither overwhelm them nor to bore them with the commissions and the jobs and tasks they have. And it is especially a challenge in Dr. Shannon Scott's area of pediatrics because it always refers to the patients and the families, which is quite similar in geriatrics and other areas. What we experienced quite recently is a problem to not recruit professional patients. So that's what we have experienced, especially in the first 2 years of the lean implementation, when we invited patient reps for all of our lean activities. And one example Dr. Goodrich mentioned a few minutes ago are the Rapid Process Improvement Workshops, or RPIWs called. And that's what we have quite regularly seen there in the early phase of the lean implementation, that patients jump from event or activity to activity and by doing this got more professional and did it almost as a way to make their living. Now, this was probably an early challenge we have experienced here, and to really develop effective patient engagement strategies. And this could be the full scope of having just or nominating just a patient advisory committee. That is the case in the approach we use in one of my projects, or it could be a way to even engage a patient to review primary papers and to identify evidence which is published in the literature, and that's what we do together with Dr. Donna Goodrich in the scoping review. So we made very good experience with a patient who has also a kind of a basic background in research, who is very helpful and was very helpful in the screening phase of the scoping review, and that's a really good example. And it means that could mean to engage a patient meaningful from just designing and tailoring a small and feasible package or job for a patient to a very broad scope of engagement, such as this patient who also helps us to screen and identify studies. We have here in Saskatchewan a patient-oriented network and funding opportunities which may differ from your patient-oriented research network in Alberta, and especially in terms of the funding opportunities. That's why I would like to close my presentation and especially the discussion about challenges of engaging patients and other stakeholders with a reminder that our Saskatchewan patient Oriented Research Center has a new director, and her name is Helen Kenyon. I do encourage all of the guys who are listening and have now an interest in patient-oriented research to contact her, please. She's our new director, and she has a whole team behind her who will definitely support your idea and further discuss your idea in the area of patient-oriented research. I should also mention that we have here in Saskatchewan, in terms of the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, targeted calls for funding patient-oriented research. We have 2 calls a year, and I definitely encourage all of the interested guys in this area to contact SHERV here in Saskatchewan. I hope that you guys in Alberta can briefly also outline who the person or the people are which should be contacted in Alberta if people need support or have an interest in patient-oriented research. And I'm sure you have also targeted calls or funding opportunities for patient-oriented research.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rauter. That was very helpful to hear about those strategies you have for engaging patients, and that's one of the questions that pops up on the screen. And so, Dr. Scott, I'd like, if you could respond to this question as well. So the question is to all panel presenters. Can you describe some of the challenges you've experienced in using an integrated KT approach and engaging various stakeholders, for example, patients, care providers, etc., through the entire research process? So maybe from an Alberta perspective, can you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much for the question. It's certainly as soon as you start doing integrated knowledge translation, as a researcher, essentially you're giving up complete control of the timeline. For me personally, I really enjoy doing integrated KT and involving end users throughout the process because I do believe that we can reach more meaningful change that way. But the largest challenge I do think is that when you are doing integrated KT, you don't always have a clear direction of where the project is going at the start. And that does present several challenges in terms of how the project will unfold, the resources you'll need, the budgets in terms of the timeline. I guess the other piece is that certainly there's a push right now for a lot of engagement and integrated KT, and I am very much a proponent of that. But we also need to keep in mind that these end users or knowledge users also have other responsibilities and jobs, and the way we involve them needs to make practical sense and needs to be respectful of the other roles that they have while not being tokenism.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good comment because we've had that question from numerous other researchers and practitioners in terms of how do you pragmatically engage patients and end users, to get valuable feedback, but again, recognizing, that they do have, limited resources. And we have another comment here. Yes, so there's a question about having the slides and access to the recording, and that will be sent out to all participants, so just watch your email for that. And given the many unknowns that can arise during integrated KT, do you have any tips for grant writing without a clearly defined endpoint, what is your approach in writing grant applications? So maybe if we start with Dr. Scott in Alberta, and then we'll go to Saskatchewan to get some insight into that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the million-dollar question, really, is that because if you are doing a truly integrated KT approach, this is one of the first challenges you will encounter is how do you provide enough detail in a grant application so that a reviewer gets a sense that you really have thought through all possibilities. So you're kind of navigating this line of uncertainty of providing enough detail, yet being open enough to have truly engaged end users as part of the process. So I really believe there's a bit of an art to that process, and there's certainly not a very prescribed approach that I could provide to say these are the definitive things that you need to do, but it's finding a balance between providing enough detail, yet ensuring that you've got really strong engagement of your knowledge users in the process. And I just want to add that you really can't overestimate how much time it takes to meaningfully involve knowledge users in your process. So in terms of the case we've got with our parent advisory group, it's not just about us getting their opinion on things. This is very much a two-way street. So we as researchers have to give something back to the parent advisory group so that they keep being willing to participate in it. So it's not as straightforward as just creating an advisory group and hoping that these volunteers will just give us all of the answers we need. For it to be authentic, it takes resources and time and energy.
I think that's a very important point to bring up, because I think that if we're engaging these patients, it's so important to do it in a meaningful and thoughtful way and ensure that we've got the resources to support it. So Drs. Goodridge and Rotter, would you be able to provide your perspective on this question? I'll just pass the control back to you.
And one of the issues for us with our patient advisors is just their general state of health. We deliberately set out in our project to include someone who had ongoing interface with the healthcare system because she has such a valuable experience. The downside to that is she is often sick. Her health doesn't allow her to participate in the team meetings.
Sorry. Hi, it's Diane here from Edmonton. We are having difficulties hearing you. Would you be able to just try speaking into your mic or using the headset, and hopefully we can hear you then?
Okay. Is this any better? Is this any better?
Sorry, again, we're having trouble hearing you.
Okay, how about this?
That is excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay. So my comment was just about, trying to engage a patient who really has a wealth of valuable information about and commentary, ongoing commentary about the challenges, say, with interdisciplinary rounds and team communication. And, because I had a previously existing relationship with her, I knew she could contribute a lot, but the challenge really is that her health doesn't allow her to, to be as present as she'd like to be. So I really reinforce what Shannon says. Like, I meet with her individually to keep her up to date on what's happening. I get her opinions. I get her feedback. She's a really important part of the team, but she can't engage as much as she would like to, and that's just really unfortunate. I think in terms of all of the unknowns, one of the key things I think is really finding the right mix of people. And with this one particular patient advisor, she has you know, when I talked to her initially about this, like her ideas were amazing, just truly amazing, and you know, I was really excited to have her on board, and really I think what she did was influence you know, a lot of the direction that the grant went in. But again, you know, it's time, and it's also getting everybody on the same page. So I think that's one of the issues, that is really starting well ahead of time to identify the people. And I think it really helps to have pre-existing relationships, at least in some way, with the people, the patient family advisors that you're working with, because I think that really helps to create an atmosphere of trust. They trust you. They know that they can go to you for support, that you value them as people, and you really want their input. So I think that's what I can add.
I would also like to add an important hint that those researchers who want to engage patients in their research should always contact the relevant health region or jurisdiction in your own context, because it is so important to neither overlap with communication that a patient may get contacted by the health region and by the researchers, which happened here, and the health regions usually do a very good job in pre-selecting potential patients, so they can already do almost the job for you in terms of selecting the patients. I made the same experience with the civility of the patients, and it's really a tricky issue to select the right patient for the right project. That's how I put it. And the earlier this process starts, absolutely, I fully support and echo Donna, the better it is for the project, for the progress the project makes, as well as it is for proposal development. So it's really important to select the right patient for the right project, and it sounds easier than it is. Again, I always recommend to select or identify patients with the support of your health region or individual jurisdiction, because this is avoiding multiple contacts of potential patients, which can definitely disappoint, definitely irritate patients. So that's a very important remark I would like to make, and I made very good experiences. Really, it was a great experience to nominate patients for the patient advisory committee. So I think that might be an effective approach to be used in other projects, because this committee allows you to dose the input from the patient side just in the way you need it. So this advisory committee or the patient can then be involved in especially the process or this piece of the project. You want and need the patient, and it gives you much more control over let's say, the level of input from the patient. It's still I believe we are in an early phase of patient-oriented research in general, and that means we are all learning, and we are all developing and getting more experience in this area. And I think that such a committee can be a very wise and bright way to have enough control and enough patient input for your project you would like to conduct.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rotter. And I think that you're right. We are in early stages of patient-oriented research, so this advice is extremely helpful. And we have a question in the room, so I'll just open that up here.
Okay. Thanks, Diane. I'm just curious because in talking about patient-oriented research, the discussions often come back to patient engagement, but it's important not to lose track, I think, of the broader knowledge translation landscape of involving, policymakers, practitioners, and so on. And so, just curious about, with the welcome emphasis on including patients. I'm just curious on the presenters' perspectives of some of the challenges sometimes of integrating a patient perspective with as you continue to work with, say, healthcare practitioners and so on in developing materials. How that integrating even more perspectives, some of the challenges in completing your work and knowing if you're coming back, I guess, to that perennial question of evaluation. As you include more voices, does it make it harder to know if you're doing a good job? I guess is what I'm asking.
Dr. Scott, did you want to start with responding, and then we'll switch back to Saskatchewan?
For sure. Thank you for the question. This is an area that we certainly struggle with, and we can certainly drown in the amount of feedback and perspectives that we do get, and certainly they are not always moving in the same direction, and they can be conflicting. In the case of case study number 6, what always grounds us is that we go back to what our key end audience is. So in other words, in the case of case study 6, these tools are being developed for patients and families. So when we're getting overwhelmed with feedback, for instance, from healthcare providers that they may not like the color and the font of a particular tool, but the parents love it, for instance, that is very helpful for us, and we're just like, we're going to go with what our end users actually need. However, if it's a point about the evidence, the healthcare evidence underpinning a particular tool, we will go with our clinician experts. There is certainly, this is an area that's very ripe for new science in terms of ways to manage and mitigate all of the different feedback that you do receive if you are really having this patient-oriented lens to your work, because researchers and research teams can quickly get overwhelmed with so much feedback that you're uncertain of how to move forward.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Excellent response. And I'm going to switch it back to Saskatchewan. So Drs. Goodrich and Roddick, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to, of course, echo Shannon with her comment based on the important work she's doing. My comment or tip goes in a similar direction, that I would recommend to have a very, very strong facilitator of a team meeting with a patient. It's very important to have a strong facilitation of those meetings, because patients sometimes tend to hijack those meetings completely and sidetrack it from the original aim or goal of this meeting, and that's why it's so important. So we badly need the patient input, but how I described it earlier on, with finding the right dose of involvement with the right patient at the right time is probably a good advice, really to really achieve what you want. And it's quite often in fully integrated knowledge translation projects, not only the patient, which is an important stakeholder, it's also about politicians, that means policymakers, it's about other stakeholders in our healthcare system, decision makers, and so on. So I do believe that the problem to engage patients meaningful is not new in research. We face these problems, especially in terms of any kind of collaborative research and integrative research approaches, and strong team facilitation. It should even start earlier with the selection of the right patient for the right project. With a very good facilitation is usually exactly the recipe you need for a successful patient-oriented research project.
Thank you. No, I agree. I think facilitation within a meeting and those types of engagement is critical. We have another question that's popped up, and so the question is, you mentioned the risk of patient professionalization. Have you tried anything to prevent this? Also, what are the main risks related to professionalization, and then why not? And so Dr. Rotter or Dr. Goodrich, would you be able to respond to that comment, to your question?
I would like to ask Dr. Donna Goodrich if she might want to start to provide an answer to the question how we could better manage this risk of professionalization, and if we have ever tried to prevent this. You might have some suggestions, or have you ever experienced this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would actually term it patient professionalization. I think, you know, it's sort of, in some ways, it's like Stockholm Syndrome when, you know, you have a hostage, the patient, who's in a room with a lot of professionals, and they you know, they begin to really empathize with some of the issues that we're feeling, and maybe, you know, they're, now that they understand things from a different perspective, they can start to minimize their own concerns. And so I think it's supporting them to really bring forward their, you know, their legitimate concerns, and I think that happens. I think the risk that you've asked about in terms of professionalization is that we won't really hear the patient's concerns, because essentially they're, you know, maybe overly sympathetic to the concerns of the healthcare system, and I think that's the main danger from my perspective.
I just want to add, Thomas Rotter here again, I just want to add that my experience was very good in terms of providing patients with the same or even better training as we trained other team members in our patient-oriented research team. So the fact or the opportunity for the patient to receive the same training and background information the team has is also a very important aspect in this kind of research.
I think that's a great point to bring up, the fact that when you're engaging these patients, it's important to be educating them and training them. So Dr. Scott, did you have anything that you wanted to add further in terms of this question regarding professionalization or training for patients?
Yes, for sure. Certainly that's in the work that Dr. Hartling and myself do with our parent advisory group. This is an area that we're very sensitive to, and we have made strides in terms of that. You know, having preliminary discussions in terms of trying to bring our parent advisory group sort of up to speed in terms of what research is and research methods, and we're really sensitive to the way we present and share information, and it does take a lot of effort and sort of forward thinking to be able to do that well.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just looking at the time. Were there any other questions in the room? Okay. So I think, we have one more question that's popped up. The track research findings that only 3% of patients get their emergency related information from libraries. This is concerning. Shannon, Dr. Scott.
Yeah, I don't know what to really say about that, other than the fact that we had over 1,000 parents that we involved in our needs assessment, and I can see why people may find that concerning. The most frequent way that families reported getting health information was through talking with trusted healthcare professionals, followed by looking for information on the internet. And that is something that I always keep front of mind in terms of the responsibility that we have as healthcare professionals and as researchers in terms of how we present and share information, and sort of the things we need to pay attention to in that respect.
Okay, so the question is, what have you found to be most effective dissemination tools for the different end users, particularly patient systems and decision makers and clinicians? And I think this was geared towards Dr. Scott.
Yeah, for sure. So great question. Thank you very much for that. So the summer of 2015, we actually did a small study with both parents and healthcare professionals in terms of different ways that they wanted to receive information. And we did a basic comparison, so comparing more academic ways of presenting information, such as bar charts, pie charts, etc., to what we think are really engaging infographics. And what we learned was that in both groups, they preferred the infographics. At that point in time, they were quite static and two-dimensional. But at this point in time, I am working with some people to take our infographics to the next level, and we're making them interactive. We do have some very preliminary trends in terms of the different types of tools and different preferences through our usability testing that we did in summer 2016 when we were doing usability testing for our croup, whiteboard, an ebook, as well as our gastroenteritis whiteboard and ebook. In our urban and rural settings, there was a very clear preference for short videos and whiteboards as compared to ebooks. However, when we went to our more remote settings, that trend was reversed. I can't say, that's, a done deal, or that we would continue to see that trend. But over the next several years, we're going to be continuing to move down that path and see if we can see any stronger patterns in terms of preferences.
I think that's very interesting because, it's so important to take into account context. And, I think there's so many different factors to consider in terms of, location, literacy levels, all those things. So I think these are all critical points and very interesting. So I'm just looking at the time, and Drs. Goodrich and Rodder, did you have anything to add to that quickly?
No, we mainly use here patient versions in the plain language of our interventions we use. I mentioned the example of clinical pathways, and Dr. Scott is doing groundbreaking research in this area, and her end products of the research which she spoke about are very good examples, and I don't have anything to add here. No, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Dr. Shannon Scott, Dr. Donna Goodrich, and Dr. Thomas Rodder for a very thought-provoking presentation. And another thank you as well to all the webinar participants who joined us today. And for anyone who came in late, I will mention again that the session has been recorded, and the link to view the webinar will be emailed to all registered participants. We will also include a link to sign up for our KT Alberta newsletter, where we would share information about upcoming events and activities. And again, I think that this area in patient-oriented research is novel. It's just newly emerging. So I think these pragmatic discussion and tools that you discussed today are really, really important. So on behalf of the Alberta Spore Knowledge Translation Platform, I'd like to wish everyone a great afternoon and hope that you'll join us again next time. Thank you.